A brilliant pediatric surgeon performed an emergency operation that violated federal law. Within 24 hours, she lost everything: her career, her reputation, her future. But 48 hours later, she received a call that would transform not just her life, but the entire American medical system. This is the story of Dr. Jessica Parker, the woman who discovered that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to save lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Jessica Parker pressed her stethoscope against the chest of 6-year-old Maria Santos, listening to the steady rhythm that meant another successful surgery was behind her. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Children's Medical Center in Dallas, casting long shadows across the pediatric ward where she had spent the last 7 years of her life. At 34, Jessica had already earned a reputation as one of the finest pediatric surgeons in Texas, known for her meticulous technique and unwavering dedication to her young patients. The smell of antiseptic and the gentle hum of medical equipment were as familiar to her as breathing. She had chosen pediatric surgery not for the prestige or the challenge, but because of moments like this, watching a child's face light up when they realized the pain was gone, seeing parents weep with relief, knowing that her hands had given families their most precious gift back. These walls had witnessed her greatest triumphs, and her deepest fears had shaped her from an ambitious medical student into a surgeon who understood that every small life on her table carried the weight of an entire family's world. Jessica's journey to this moment had been anything but ordinary. Growing up as the daughter of a mechanic in a small town outside Fort Worth, she had learned early that success required more than talent. It demanded relentless perseverance and an unshakable belief in doing what was right, even when the world seemed stacked against you. Her father, Miguel Parker, had immigrated from Mexico as a young man, working 18-hour days to build a life for his family. Her mother, Susan, had been a school nurse who spent her evenings teaching Jessica that healing others was both a privilege and a responsibility that transcended any single institution or set of rules. The path to medical school had been paved, with scholarship applications, part-time jobs, and countless nights studying by lamplight while her parents worked late to pay the bills. Jessica remembered the day she received her acceptance letter to Baylor College of Medicine, how her father had cried openly for the first time she could remember, and how her mother had quietly whispered that she had always known this day would come. Medical school had been a crucible that tested not just her intellect but her character, teaching her that the human body was both magnificently resilient and heartbreakingly fragile. Her residency at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia had been where she truly discovered her calling. Unlike adult surgery, where patients could advocate for themselves and make informed decisions, pediatric surgery required a different kind of courage. Children trusted completely, their families placing impossible faith in her abilities, and every decision carried consequences that would ripple through decades of a young life. She had learned to read the fear in parents' eyes, to communicate complex medical realities in ways that preserved hope while honoring truth, and to carry the weight of responsibility that came with holding the future in her hands. When the opportunity arose to join Children's Medical Center in Dallas, Jessica had known immediately that this was where she belonged. The hospital served one of the most diverse populations in the country, treating children from every background imaginable. Many of her patients came from families who had traveled hundreds of miles seeking care, often carrying life savings in envelopes and speaking languages that the hospital's translation services struggled to accommodate. Jessica had made it her mission to bridge these gaps, learning conversational Spanish and working with community organizations to ensure that language and cultural barriers never stood between a child and the care they needed. Her colleagues respected her not just for her surgical skills, but for her advocacy. Jessica had successfully pushed for extended translation services, had organized free medical camps in underserved communities, and had testified before the State Medical Board about the need for more flexible consent procedures in emergency situations. She understood that medicine was never just about the technical aspects of surgery. It was about seeing patients as whole human beings, within complex family systems, each deserving dignity and the very best care possible. The hospital itself had become Jessica's second home. She knew every corner of the building, from the brightly painted pediatric wing with its cartoon characters and rainbow decorations to the sterile precision of the operating rooms, where she spent most of her waking hours. Her office was small, but warm, filled with thank you cards from families, photos of former patients at graduations and birthday parties, and a small collection of toys that nervous children often left behind. The staff knew her as someone who never asked others to work harder than she worked herself, who remembered birthdays and family milestones, and who could be counted on to stay late when a complex case required her attention. Jessica's personal life had often taken a backseat to her career, something she neither regretted nor celebrated. It simply was. Relationships had come and gone, unable to compete with the demands of a profession that required her to be available for emergencies at any hour. She lived in a modest apartment 15 minutes from the hospital, a space that felt more like a place to sleep and prepare for the next day than a true home. Her real home was here, among the beeping monitors and sterile corridors where she could make a tangible difference in the world. That Tuesday evening in September had started like countless others. Jessica had completed 2 scheduled surgeries, a routine appendectomy and a more complex procedure to repair a congenital heart defect, and was making her evening rounds to check on patients before heading home. The pediatric ward was settling into its nighttime rhythm, with parents keeping vigil beside their children's beds and nurses moving quietly between rooms, checking vital signs and administering medications. Jessica took comfort in this familiar routine, the sense of order and purpose that defined her days. She had just finished examining little Antonio Rodriguez, whose gallbladder surgery had gone perfectly that morning, when she heard the distant wail of sirens approaching the hospital. Emergency vehicles were common enough that most staff barely noticed them anymore, but something about the urgency in the sound made Jessica pause. She watched through the window as an ambulance sped into the emergency bay, its lights painting the parking lot in harsh reds and blues. A moment later, her pager buzzed with an urgent message that would change everything. The emergency department was requesting immediate surgical consultation for a pediatric trauma case. Jessica grabbed her white coat and headed for the elevator, her mind already shifting into the focused state that emergency situations demanded. She had responded to hundreds of such calls over the years, each one a reminder that a normal evening could transform into a life or death situation without warning. As the elevator descended, she mentally reviewed the protocols for pediatric trauma, the decision trees that would guide her assessment and treatment recommendations. The emergency department buzzed with controlled chaos as Jessica stepped off the elevator. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency between treatment bays, their voices calm but urgent as they communicated vital signs and treatment updates. The familiar sounds of medical equipment created a symphony of healing that Jessica found oddly comforting. The steady beep of heart monitors, the rhythmic whoosh of ventilators, the quiet conversations between doctors and families that could mean the difference between hope and despair. Dr. Amanda Chun, the emergency physician who had called for the consultation, spotted Jessica immediately and hurried over. Amanda was one of the most competent emergency doctors Yeshiga had ever worked with, someone whose calm demeanor and quick thinking had saved countless lives over the years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The worry lines around Amanda's eyes told Jessica that this case was different, more complicated than the routine trauma calls that usually brought them together. Jessica, "Thank God you're here," Amanda said, her voice tight with concern. "We've got an 8-year-old boy, Tommy Chun, no relation, who was hit by a car about 40 minutes ago. Massive internal bleeding, possible splenic rupture, blood pressure dropping fast despite transfusions. He needs surgery immediately, but we've hit a legal wall that I've never encountered before." Jessica felt her heart rate increase as she processed the information. Splenic ruptures in children were serious but treatable if addressed quickly. The mention of a legal complication, however, was unusual and concerning. In pediatric emergency medicine, legal issues typically involved custody disputes or questions about who could provide consent for treatment. Jessica had dealt with such situations before, but the urgency in Amanda's voice suggested something more complex. "What kind of legal issue?" Jessica asked as they walked quickly toward the trauma bay. "Are the parents unavailable?" Amanda's expression grew even more troubled. "They're here, but they speak very limited English and are recent immigrants. The father keeps saying something about not having proper documentation, and the mother is too distraught to communicate clearly. Our usual translation service is backed up for over an hour, and the hospital's legal team is insisting we need documented informed consent before any surgical intervention. They're worried about liability if we proceed without proper communication." Jessica felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had encountered similar situations before, where language barriers and bureaucratic procedures created dangerous delays in patient care. The hospital's legal department, while well-intentioned, sometimes prioritized institutional protection over patient needs. In her experience, families who had traveled far seeking medical care often carried additional fears about authority figures and documentation that could complicate an already traumatic situation. They reached Trauma Bay 3, where Jessica got her first look at Tommy Chun. The boy lay unconscious on the gurney, his small body dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. Multiple 4 lines delivered fluids and medications while monitors tracked his vital signs, each beep a reminder that time was running out. His skin had the pale, grayish tint that Jessica recognized as a sign of significant blood loss, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Beside the bed, a man and woman in their 30s held each other in their child's hands, their faces etched with terror and helplessness. The woman whispered what sounded like prayers in Mandarin while tears streamed down her face. The man kept glancing between his son and the medical staff, his eyes darting with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned to fear authority figures. Their clothes were simple but clean, and Jessica noticed the woman clutching a small purse that probably contained everything of value they owned. Tommy Chun, age 8, struck by vehicle at approximately 19:30 hours, the trauma nurse reported as Jessica approached the bed. Initial presentation showed signs of internal bleeding, blood pressure 750/40 and dropping. "We've administered 2 units of O-negative blood and started aggressive fluid resuscitation, but his pressure isn't stabilizing. CT scan confirms splenic laceration with active bleeding." Jessica moved to examine Tommy, her hands gentle but thorough as she assessed his condition. The boy's abdomen was distended and tender, classic signs of internal bleeding that confirmed the CT findings. His pulse was rapid and weak, indicating that his body was struggling to compensate for blood loss. Most concerning was his altered mental status. While initially conscious at the scene, he was now responding only to painful stimuli, suggesting that his brain wasn't receiving adequate oxygen. "How long since the accident?" Jessica asked, already knowing that time was becoming critically short. "About 50 minutes now," Amanda replied. "The paramedics did excellent work getting him here quickly, but every minute we delay surgery increases the risk of irreversible shock." Jessica looked at Tommy's parents, seeing her own father's face and the man's worried expression, and recognizing the universal language of parental fear that transcended cultural boundaries. She approached them slowly, speaking in the simple Spanish. phrases she had learned over the years, hoping to bridge the communication gap even if she couldn't speak their native language directly. "Hablan español?" she asked gently. The father nodded slightly, relief flickering in his eyes at hearing something familiar. "Un poco," he replied, holding up his hand to indicate a small amount. "My son, he will be okay." Jessica felt the weight of the moment settling around her. Here was a family that had probably traveled far seeking a better life, now facing every parent's worst nightmare in a place where language barriers made everything more frightening. Their child was dying while bureaucratic procedures prevented the treatment that could save his life. She had dedicated her career to moments like this, but she had never faced a situation where the very systems designed to protect patients were actively endangering one. The trauma bay suddenly filled with additional people as Dr. Richard Matthews, the chief of surgery, arrived with 2 members of the hospital's legal team. Dr. Matthews was a competent surgeon but had always prioritized institutional protocols over individual patient needs. His presence usually meant that complex legal or administrative issues were complicating patient care. The legal team members carried tablets and folders, their professional attire and serious expressions, creating an atmosphere of formal bureaucracy that felt completely out of place in the urgent medical environment. "Dr. Parker," Dr. Matthews said in his characteristic authoritative tone, "I understand you've been called to consult on this case. Before we proceed, we need to address some significant consent issues." Jessica felt her jaw tighten as she realized that Tommy's life was about to become secondary to legal procedures. "Dr. Matthews, this child has a splenic rupture with active bleeding. He needs emergency surgery immediately. Every minute we delay increases his risk of death." "I understand the medical urgency," Dr. Matthews replied, "but we have a legal obligation to ensure proper informed consent. The parents don't appear to understand the nature of the proposed surgery, the risks involved, or the alternatives available. Without documented informed consent, we could face serious liability issues." One of the legal team members stepped forward, consulting her tablet. "Additionally, there are questions about the family's documentation status that could affect our obligation to provide care. The hospital has policies about treating undocumented patients that require additional administrative approval." Jessica stared at them in disbelief. "Are you seriously suggesting that we let this child die while we sort out paperwork? This is an emergency situation that falls under federal UNTALA requirements. We're legally obligated to provide stabilizing care regardless of documentation status. Emergency stabilization doesn't necessarily include surgical intervention," the legal advisor replied. "The family needs to understand what they're consenting to, and we need to ensure that all proper procedures are followed." Tommy's mother seemed to sense the tension in the room, her quiet crying becoming more urgent as she spoke rapidly in Mandarin to her husband. The father stepped forward, his voice breaking as he tried to communicate in his limited English. "Please, Dr. Lady," he said, addressing Jessica directly. "My boy, he is good boy. We come here for help. Please, you save him." The simple eloquence of his plea cut straight through Jessica's heart. This was why she had become a doctor, not to navigate legal complexities or protect institutional interests, but to answer the desperate need of parents who trusted her with their most precious gift. She looked at Tommy's pale face, imagining him healthy and laughing, playing with friends and looking forward to a future that was slipping away with each passing minute. Dr. Matthews continued his explanation of the legal requirements while Tommy's blood pressure continued to drop and his mental status deteriorated further. Jessica watched the monitors, calculating how much longer the boy could survive without surgical intervention. Her medical training told her that they had perhaps 30 minutes before irreversible damage occurred, while the legal discussion showed no signs of reaching a timely resolution. How long will it take to get proper translation services and complete the consent process? Jessica asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "At least 2 hours," Dr. Matthews replied. "We need certified translation, full explanation of the risks and benefits, time for the family to ask questions and consider their options, and proper documentation of their understanding. The legal team also needs to review the family's status and our obligations." Jessica felt something fundamental shift inside her as she realized that institutional bureaucracy was about to triumph over medical necessity. 2 hours would be far too late for Tommy Chun. He would die not from his injuries, which were treatable, but from a system that prioritized legal protection over human life. She thought about her father's courage in leaving everything behind to build a better future for his family, about her mother's belief that healing others was sacred work that transcended political and legal boundaries. Tommy's father had somehow understood the nature of the delay and was becoming increasingly agitated, his voice rising as he spoke rapidly in Mandarin to his wife. The mother collapsed into a chair beside the bed, her grief already transitioning from hope to despair as she seemed to realize that help might not come in time. Their reaction confirmed what Jessica already knew. This family understood that their child was dying and that the people who could save him were choosing not to act. Jessica made a decision that would change everything. She turned to Dr. Matthews and the legal team with a calm that surprised even her. "I'm going to surgery with this child. Document that I'm taking full personal and professional responsibility for this decision. If there are legal consequences, they're mine alone." Dr. Matthews stepped forward, his voice sharp with authority. "Dr. Parker, I'm ordering you not to proceed. This surgery cannot happen without proper consent. If you violate hospital policy and state law, you'll face immediate termination and professional sanctions." Jessica looked at him steadily, feeling the clarity that came with understanding exactly what was right and what was wrong. "Then document that as well. But I'm not letting this child die while we debate paperwork." She turned to Tommy's parents, speaking slowly in her limited Spanish combined with gestures and the universal language of compassion. "Voy a ayudar a su hijo. Surgery. I will help your son." The father's eyes filled with tears as he understood, and he nodded vigorously while speaking rapidly to his wife. They both began nodding, their expressions showing the desperate hope of parents who had found someone willing to fight for their child's life. The trauma team, who had been standing quietly during the legal discussion, suddenly sprang into action as Jessica began preparing for emergency surgery. They had worked with her for years and trusted her judgment completely. Within minutes, they were moving Tommy toward the operating room while Dr. Matthews and the legal team tried unsuccessfully to halt the process. As Jessica scrubbed in for surgery, she felt the familiar calm that always descended when she was about to operate. Her hands moved through the practiced motions of preparation, while her mind focused entirely on the task ahead. She had performed dozens of splenic repairs, but never under such legally precarious circumstances. The weight of her decision pressed against her consciousness, but she pushed it aside to concentrate on what mattered most: saving Tommy's life. The operating room fell into the focused silence that accompanied emergency surgery. Jessica's team worked with the precision and coordination that came from years of collaboration, each person anticipating the other's needs without spoken communication. The monitors showed Tommy's vital signs stabilizing slightly as the anesthesia took effect, buying them precious time to repair the damage. Jessica made her incision with steady hands, her years of training guiding every movement as she worked to control the bleeding and assess the extent of Tommy's injuries. The splenic laceration was significant but repairable, and she felt a surge of hope as she began the meticulous work of rebuilding what the accident had torn apart. Time seemed to slow as she focused entirely on the small body before her, pouring all of her skill and determination into giving this child a future. 4 hours later, Jessica emerged from surgery exhausted but triumphant. Tommy's vital signs were stable, his blood pressure had normalized, and the repair looked excellent. He would recover completely, would go home to his parents, would grow up to live the life that had almost been stolen from him. As she changed out of her surgical scrubs, Jessica felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had made the right choice, regardless of the consequences that were undoubtedly waiting for her. The aftermath of her decision would unfold in ways she could never have imagined, setting in motion events that would transform not just her own life, but the entire landscape of American medical ethics. But in that moment, walking through the quiet hospital corridors toward an uncertain future, Jessica Parker knew with absolute certainty that she had honored the promise she had made years ago to use her skills in service of others, no matter the personal cost. Dawn was breaking over Dallas when Jessica first learned that her decision to operate on Tommy Chun had created ripples far beyond the hospital walls. She had spent the night in the surgical ICU, monitoring Tommy's recovery and ensuring his vital signs remained stable. The boy had awakened briefly around 4 in the morning, his eyes finding his mother's face with the confused clarity of someone emerging from anesthesia. Mrs. Chun had whispered soft words in Mandarin, while tears of relief streamed down her cheeks, and Tommy had managed a weak smile before drifting back into healing sleep. Jessica had finally allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction as she watched the family's reunion. Mr. Chun had held his wife while they both gazed at their son, their faces transformed from the terror she had witnessed hours earlier to something resembling peace. Through broken English and gestures, they had tried to express their gratitude, but Jessica had simply squeezed Mrs. Chun's hand and assured them that Tommy would make a full recovery. In that moment, surrounded by the soft beeping of monitors and the gentle breathing of a sleeping child, Jessica felt certain she had made the right choice. The first sign that her world was about to change came when Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the hospital's chief administrator, appeared in the ICU at 6:30 in the morning. Rebecca was known for her diplomatic approach to hospital politics and rarely appeared on clinical floors, unless serious administrative issues demanded her attention. Her presence at such an early hour, combined with the tight expression on her usually composed face, immediately put Jessica on alert. "Dr. Parker, I need to speak with you privately," Rebecca said quietly, glancing toward Tommy's bed where his parents maintained their vigil. "It's urgent." They walked in silence to a small conference room adjacent to the ICU, where Rebecca closed the door and turned to face Jessica with an expression that mixed sympathy with professional concern. Jessica had worked with Rebecca for several years and had always found her to be fair-minded and supportive of clinical staff, which made her obvious discomfort even more troubling. "Jessica, I want you to know that personally, I admire what you did last night," Rebecca began carefully. "Tommy Chun is alive because of your courage and skill. However, the legal and administrative implications of your decision are more complex than either of us initially realized." Jessica felt her stomach tighten as she prepared for what was clearly going to be unwelcome news. What kind of implications? Rebecca consulted a folder she had been carrying, her reluctance to deliver the information evident in every gesture. Shortly after Tommy's surgery concluded, the hospital's legal department was contacted by representatives from the Texas Medical Board. Apparently, Dr. Matthews filed a formal report about the circumstances of the surgery, citing violations of informed consent protocols and state medical laws. The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. The Texas Medical Board had the authority to investigate physician conduct and, if they found violations, could impose sanctions ranging from formal reprimands to license suspension or revocation. A formal investigation would not only threaten her ability to practice medicine, but would also become part of her permanent professional record, potentially affecting her career prospects for years to come. "But this was an emergency situation," Jessica protested. "The child would have died without immediate intervention. Surely the medical board understands that emergency protocols allow for flexibility in consent procedures." Rebecca's expression grew even more troubled. That's where the situation becomes complicated. The medical board is arguing that alternative options existed, such as seeking emergency court authorization for treatment or pursuing other forms of consent documentation. They're suggesting that your decision to proceed without exhausting these alternatives constitutes a pattern of disregard for established medical ethics. Jessica stared at Rebecca in disbelief. Alternative options that would have taken hours while an 8-year-old child bled to death? How is that ethical? I agree with you completely, Rebecca replied. But the medical board operates under different priorities than emergency physicians. They're focused on maintaining professional standards and protecting the integrity of the consent process, even in situations where those standards might conflict with immediate patient needs. The full weight of Jessica's situation began to settle over her as she realized that her decision to save Tommy's life had placed her in direct conflict with the very institutions that governed her profession. She had always understood that medicine involved difficult choices, but she had never imagined that choosing to save a child's life could be construed as professional misconduct. What happens next? Jessica asked, though she dreaded the answer. Rebecca opened her folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. The medical board has initiated a formal investigation into your conduct. You'll receive these papers officially later today, but I wanted to give you advance warning. The investigation will examine whether your actions violated state medical consent laws and hospital protocols. During the investigation period, which could last several months, your surgical privileges will be suspended pending the board's findings. Jessica felt the room spinning slightly as the implications of Rebecca's words sank in. Suspended surgical privileges meant she could not perform operations, effectively ending her ability to practice her specialty. Without the ability to operate, she would be unable to fulfill her duties as a pediatric surgeon, leaving the hospital with no choice but to place her on administrative leave or terminate her employment entirely. Rebecca, I've dedicated my entire career to helping children, Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never had a single complaint filed against me, never had a malpractice suit, never violated any ethical guidelines. How can they destroy my career because I saved a child's life? Rebecca's eyes filled with sympathy as she watched Jessica struggle to process the information. Jessica, I want you to know that the hospital administration does not support this investigation. We believe you acted appropriately under impossible circumstances, and we're prepared to provide character references and support during the hearing process. However, we're also obligated to comply with medical board directives while the investigation is ongoing. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes as Rebecca explained the formal procedures that would govern the investigation, the timeline for hearings and appeals, and the hospital's limited ability to protect Jessica from the consequences of her decision. By the time they finished talking, Jessica felt as though she had entered an alternate reality, where saving a child's life was treated as a criminal act and bureaucratic procedures took precedence over human compassion. When Jessica returned to the ICU to check on Tommy one final time before leaving the hospital, she found the Chun family still maintaining their bedside vigil. Tommy was awake and alert, his color much improved from the previous night, and he even managed to wave weakly when he saw Jessica approaching. Mrs. Chun immediately stood and embraced Jessica, speaking rapidly in Mandarin while gesturing toward her son. Though Jessica couldn't understand the words, the gratitude and love in the woman's voice were unmistakable. Mr. Chun approached more hesitantly, his eyes reflecting the complex emotions of a man who had learned to be wary of authority figures, but who also recognized that Jessica had risked everything to save his son. "Dr. Lady," he said in his careful English, "you are an angel, you save our Tommy, we never forget." Jessica knelt beside Tommy's bed, taking the boy's small hand in hers. "How are you feeling, Tommy?" she asked in simple English, hoping he might understand. "Better," Tommy replied in accented but clear English that surprised everyone in the room. "Mama says you fixed me." The simple innocence of his statement nearly broke Jessica's composure. Here was the reason she had become a doctor, the purpose that had sustained her through years of training and countless difficult cases. This child would grow up, would learn and play and contribute to the world, because she had chosen to act when bureaucratic procedures would have let him die. Whatever legal consequences she faced, that truth remained unchanged. As Jessica prepared to leave the hospital, she was intercepted by Dr. Amanda Chun, the emergency physician who had first called her for consultation on Tommy's case. Amanda's expression was troubled, and she clearly had something important to discuss. "Jessica, I wanted to talk to you before you left," Amanda said, leading her to a quiet corner of the hallway. "I've been thinking about what happened last night, and I want you to know that I fully support the decision you made. That child would have died if you hadn't acted." "Thank you, Amanda. That means more to me than you know." Amanda hesitated before continuing. "There's something else you should know. I've been getting calls this morning from other hospitals in the region, asking about the details of Tommy's case. Word is spreading quickly through the medical community, and opinions are divided. Some physicians are calling you a hero who put patient care above bureaucratic nonsense. Others are saying you set a dangerous precedent by ignoring established consent procedures." Jessica felt a chill as she realized that her decision was becoming a topic of debate throughout the medical community. Professional reputation was crucial in medicine, built over years of careful practice and easily destroyed by controversy. If significant numbers of her colleagues viewed her actions as inappropriate, it could affect her ability to find employment. Even if she successfully defended herself against the medical board's investigation. "What's your sense of how most physicians are responding?" Jessica asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "It's honestly split," Amanda replied. "Emergency physicians and surgeons tend to support what you did because they understand the reality of life and death decisions. But administrators, legal advisors, and some specialists are concerned about the liability implications and the potential for similar situations to spiral out of control." The complexity of the situation was becoming clearer to Jessica as she realized that her case touched on fundamental tensions within modern medicine. Healthcare had become increasingly regulated and bureaucratized in response to legitimate concerns about patient safety and legal liability. But those same regulations sometimes created barriers to providing care in emergency situations. Her decision to prioritize immediate patient needs over administrative procedures had exposed these tensions in a way that made many people uncomfortable. When Jessica finally left the hospital that morning, she felt as though she was walking away from everything that had defined her adult life. The building that had been her second home for 7 years now felt foreign and unwelcoming. Its familiar corridors transformed into a maze of legal and professional obstacles. She had entered as Dr. Jessica Parker, respected pediatric surgeon, and was leaving as someone whose career hung in the balance because she had chosen to save a child's life. The drive to her apartment took her through neighborhoods she knew well, past the community centers where she had organized free medical clinics, and the schools where she had spoken to children about health and safety. These were the communities she had dedicated her career to serving, places where families like the Chuns struggled to navigate complex medical and legal systems while seeking basic health care for their children. The irony that her commitment to serving these communities had now placed her own future in jeopardy was not lost on her. Jessica's apartment felt strangely empty when she arrived home, as though the events of the past 12 hours had somehow changed the familiar space. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, staring out the window at the city that was just beginning to wake up to a new day. Somewhere in that city, Tommy Chun was recovering in his hospital bed, surrounded by parents who no longer had to face the unthinkable loss of their child. That knowledge provided some comfort, but it did little to ease her anxiety about the uncertain future she now faced. Roadblock: the formal notification from the Texas Medical Board arrived at Jessica's apartment 3 days later, delivered by certified mail in a thick envelope that seemed to radiate official disapproval. She had spent those 3 days in a strange limbo, unable to return to work but not yet officially suspended, fielding calls from colleagues who had heard rumors about her situation and trying to process the rapid transformation of her life. The envelope sat unopened on her kitchen table for nearly an hour while she gathered the courage to confront whatever it contained. The documents inside were even more serious than Rebecca Martinez had indicated. The medical board had not simply initiated an investigation. They had filed formal charges alleging multiple violations of state medical practice laws and professional ethics guidelines. The language was clinical and impersonal, reducing her decision to save Tommy's life to a series of regulatory infractions that carried the potential for severe professional sanctions. The primary charge was failure to obtain proper informed consent prior to surgical intervention, a violation that the board characterized as a fundamental breach of patient rights and medical ethics. Secondary charges included willful disregard of hospital policies and procedures, and endangering patient safety through unauthorized medical treatment. Each charge carried its own potential penalties, ranging from formal censure to permanent license revocation. Jessica read through the documents multiple times, trying to understand how the language of medical regulation could transform an act of life-saving heroism into a catalog of professional failures. The charges made no mention of Tommy's critical condition, the time constraints that had made traditional consent procedures impossible, or the successful outcome of the surgery. Instead, they focused entirely on her failure to follow established protocols, as though those protocols existed independently of the human realities they were meant to address. The hearing date was set for 6 weeks in the future, giving Jessica time to prepare a defense but also ensuring that her suspension from surgical practice would extend for at least that long. The board's letter advised her to retain legal counsel, given the serious nature of the charges and the potential impact on your professional license and career. The suggestion that she might need a lawyer to defend her decision to save a child's life struck Jessica as both absurd and terrifying. Dr. Richard Matthews had clearly provided extensive documentation to support the board's investigation. The file included detailed timelines of the events surrounding Tommy's surgery, copies of hospital policies regarding informed consent, and statements from legal staff members who had advised against proceeding with the operation. Matthews had also included his own professional assessment that alternative options existed for obtaining proper consent that Dr. Parker chose to ignore in favor of unauthorized surgical intervention. Jessica found herself growing angry as she read Matthews' characterization of the events. His clinical language deliberately obscured the human reality of the situation, presenting her choice as though she had time for lengthy deliberation rather than minutes to save a dying child. His emphasis on alternative options conveniently ignored the fact that those alternatives would have resulted in Tommy's death, making them ethically meaningless regardless of their legal validity. The most disturbing aspect of the board's case was their complete dismissal of the emergency nature of Tommy's condition. Medical regulations typically included provisions for emergency treatment that allowed physicians to provide life-saving care without traditional consent procedures. But the board was arguing that Jessica had failed to demonstrate that such emergency provisions applied to Tommy's case. They contended that the availability of translation services, even if delayed, meant that proper consent could have been obtained given sufficient patience and effort. Jessica contacted Dr. Sarah Williams, a medical malpractice attorney who had been recommended by several colleagues, and scheduled an appointment to discuss her case. The conversation was both enlightening and deeply troubling, as Sarah explained the complex legal landscape that would govern Jessica's defense, and the significant challenges they would face in challenging the medical board's position. The fundamental problem, Sarah explained during their first meeting, is that medical boards are designed to protect the integrity of professional standards, not to evaluate the human circumstances that might justify deviating from those standards. They approach cases like yours from a purely regulatory perspective, asking whether established procedures were followed rather than whether the outcome justified the means. Sarah reviewed the board's charges carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions about the timeline of events and the decision-making process that led to Jessica's choice to operate. Her questions were thorough and sometimes uncomfortable, forcing Jessica to confront aspects of her decision that she had not fully examined in the immediate aftermath of the surgery. One of the challenges we'll face, Sarah continued, is that the board will argue you had alternatives that you chose not to pursue. They'll focus on the fact that translation services were available, even if delayed, and that emergency court orders could have been sought to authorize treatment. Our task will be to demonstrate that these alternatives were not realistically viable, given Tommy's medical condition. The legal strategy that Sarah outlined required Jessica to prove not only that her decision was medically appropriate, but that following standard procedures would have resulted in Tommy's death. This burden of proof was complicated by the fact that medical outcomes were rarely certain, and opposing experts could argue that Tommy might have survived even with treatment delays. The board's case, by contrast, only required them to demonstrate that established procedures existed and that Jessica had failed to follow them. Jessica learned that her case had attracted attention from medical ethics organizations and physician advocacy groups across the country. Some supported her position, arguing that rigid adherence to consent procedures could conflict with physicians' fundamental obligation to preserve life. Others expressed concern that relaxing consent requirements, even in emergency situations, could erode important patient protections and open the door to medical paternalism. The American Medical Association had issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the complexity of cases involving emergency treatment and consent issues. While stopping short of taking a position on Jessica's specific situation, the statement emphasized the importance of both informed consent and timely medical intervention, effectively placing responsibility on individual physicians to navigate these conflicting obligations without providing clear guidance about how to do so. Medical schools and teaching hospitals were using Jessica's case as a discussion topic in ethics courses, presenting it as an example of the real-world dilemmas that physicians faced when regulatory requirements conflicted with patient care. Some faculty members argued that Jessica had acted appropriately under impossible circumstances, while others maintained that consent procedures existed for important reasons and should not be abandoned, even in emergency situations. The debate within the medical community was particularly painful for Jessica because it revealed how deeply physicians disagreed about fundamental questions of medical ethics and patient care. Colleagues she had worked with for years were taking opposing positions on her case, with some offering support and others maintaining conspicuous silence that suggested disapproval of her actions. The professional relationships that had sustained her throughout her career were being strained by disagreements about the proper balance between regulation and patient advocacy. Jessica's situation was further complicated by the fact that Tommy Chun's case had attracted media attention, with local news outlets covering the story as an example of the challenges faced by immigrant families seeking medical care. While the coverage was generally sympathetic to both Jessica and the Chun family, it also increased the pressure on the medical board to take decisive action in order to demonstrate their commitment to maintaining professional standards. The Chun family had attempted to provide statements supporting Jessica's actions, but their limited English and immigration status made them reluctant to become more deeply involved in what was clearly becoming a complex legal proceeding. Mr. Shun had spoken briefly to a reporter, saying simply that the doctor lady saved our boy, but their attorney had advised against further public statements that might complicate their own legal situation. Jessica found herself caught between competing obligations and loyalties as she prepared for the hearing. Her legal counsel advised focusing on the technical medical aspects of the case and avoiding broader statements about medical ethics or healthcare policy that might alienate board members. However, Jessica felt strongly that the issues raised by her case extended far beyond her individual situation and reflected fundamental problems with how medical regulation balanced patient safety against bureaucratic compliance. The financial burden of defending herself was becoming a significant concern as legal fees mounted and her income from surgical practice disappeared. Jessica had some savings, but the combination of reduced income and increasing legal expenses was quickly depleting her resources. She had considered seeking a loan or selling some possessions, but the uncertainty about her future earning capacity made financial planning almost impossible. Support from unexpected sources began to emerge as word of Jessica's situation spread. Through professional networks and community organizations, a group of pediatric surgeons from across Texas had organized a legal defense fund to help cover her attorney fees, while medical schools and professional associations were offering to provide expert witnesses to testify about the appropriateness of her actions. The outpouring of support was encouraging, but it also highlighted how unusual her situation was and how uncertain the outcome remained. 3 weeks before her scheduled hearing with the Texas Medical Board, Jessica received a phone call that would transform her case from a local professional dispute into a national controversy. The caller was Dr. Margaret Foster, a medical ethicist at Harvard Medical School who had been following Jessica's situation through professional networks and media coverage. Dr. Foster's reputation in the field of medical ethics was impeccable, and her interest in Jessica's case suggested that the implications extended far beyond a single physician's career. Dr. Parker, I've been studying the details of your case, and I believe it represents a critical moment in the evolution of medical ethics and patient care, Dr. Foster began during their lengthy phone conversation. The fundamental question your case raises is whether physicians have an obligation to prioritize patient welfare over regulatory compliance when those two imperatives conflict. Dr. Foster explained that Jessica's situation had resonated with medical ethicists because it highlighted tensions that had been building within the healthcare system for years. As medical practice became increasingly regulated and bureaucratized, physicians were finding themselves in situations where following established procedures sometimes conflicted with their clinical judgment and their fundamental obligation to do no harm. Jessica's case provided a clear example of these conflicts and an opportunity to examine how they should be resolved. What makes your case particularly significant, Dr. Foster continued, is that you achieved an unambiguously positive outcome by violating established procedures. Tommy Chun is alive and healthy because you chose to prioritize his immediate medical needs over consent protocols. That creates a powerful argument for the position that physicians must sometimes exercise independent judgment even when it conflicts with institutional requirements. The conversation with Dr. Foster helped Jessica understand that her decision to operate on Tommy had implications far beyond her individual career. Medical professionals across the country were watching her case because it would help establish precedents for how similar situations should be handled in the future. The medical board's decision would effectively determine whether physicians could rely on emergency provisions to justify deviating from standard consent procedures, or whether such deviations would be treated as professional misconduct regardless of their outcomes. Dr. Foster offered to testify as an expert witness during Jessica's hearing, providing testimony about the ethical frameworks that supported her decision to prioritize patient care over procedural compliance. Her willingness to become involved in the case provided both practical support for Jessica's defense and validation that her actions were consistent with recognized principles of medical ethics. However, it also increased the stakes of the hearing by transforming it into a broader debate about the future of medical practice. Jessica's attorney, Sarah Williams, was encouraged by Dr. Foster's involvement, but cautioned that it might also work against them by making the case more complex and contentious. Medical board hearings typically focused on narrow questions of professional conduct rather than broad philosophical issues about medical ethics. By framing Jessica's case in terms of fundamental principles rather than specific circumstances, they risked alienating board members who preferred to avoid controversial policy questions. The challenge, Sarah explained, is that we need to convince the board that your actions were justified under existing regulations, not that those regulations should be changed. If we present this as a case for reforming consent procedures, we're essentially admitting that you violated current standards while arguing that those standards are inappropriate. That's a much harder case to win than demonstrating that your actions fell within acceptable emergency protocols. The strategic discussions with her legal team forced Jessica to confront difficult questions about her motivations and decision-making process. While she remained convinced that she had made the right choice in operating on Tommy, she also had to acknowledge that her decision had been influenced by factors beyond pure medical necessity. Her personal background as the daughter of immigrants, her commitment to serving underserved communities, and her frustration with bureaucratic barriers to patient care had all played roles in her choice to prioritize Tommy's needs over institutional requirements. These personal factors complicated her legal defense because they suggested that her decision was based on individual values and beliefs rather than objective medical criteria. The medical board would likely argue that physicians could not be permitted to make subjective judgments about when to follow established procedures, since such discretion could lead to inconsistent and potentially dangerous variations in patient care. Jessica would need to demonstrate that her decision was medically necessary rather than personally motivated, even though the two factors were inextricably linked in her own mind. Jessica's preparation for the hearing involved countless hours of reviewing medical literature, legal precedents, and ethical guidelines that might support her position. She studied emergency medicine protocols from hospitals across the country, looking for examples of situations where physicians had successfully justified deviating from standard consent procedures. She also researched international medical practices to understand how other healthcare systems balanced patient autonomy against emergency medical needs. The research process was both encouraging and discouraging, as Jessica discovered that her situation was far from unique, but that outcomes in similar cases varied widely depending on local regulations and institutional policies. Some physicians who had made decisions similar to hers had been supported by their institutions and professional organizations, while others had faced significant sanctions for identical actions. The inconsistency suggested that her case would likely depend more on the specific composition and attitudes of the Texas Medical Board than on any clear legal or ethical principles. Dr. Amanda Chun, the emergency physician who had initially called Jessica for consultation on Tommy's case, had agreed to testify on her behalf and provide a detailed account of the medical circumstances that led to Jessica's decision. Amanda's testimony would be crucial because she could speak to the time constraints and medical urgency that made traditional consent procedures impractical. Her perspective as an emergency medicine specialist would also carry significant weight. With board members who might be unfamiliar with the realities of emergency medical decision-making, the Chun family remained supportive of Jessica despite the legal complexities surrounding their son's case. Tommy had made a complete recovery and was back in school, showing no lasting effects from either his accident or the surgical intervention that had saved his life. His parents had prepared written statements expressing their gratitude for Jessica's actions and their belief that she had acted appropriately under the circumstances. However, Their immigration status and limited English continued to make them reluctant to become more actively involved in the legal proceedings. Jessica's case had attracted attention from immigrant rights organizations, who saw it as an example of how language barriers and documentation concerns could create additional obstacles to healthcare access. These groups argued that Jessica's willingness to treat Tommy, despite consent complications, demonstrated the kind of advocacy that was necessary to ensure that immigrant families received appropriate medical care. Their support was welcome, but it also risked politicizing her case in ways that might work against her in front of a medical board that preferred to avoid controversial social issues. The media coverage of Jessica's situation had grown more extensive as her hearing date approached, with national medical journals and healthcare publications covering the case as an example of the tensions between medical regulation and patient care. Some articles portrayed Jessica as a hero who had risked her career to save a child's life, while others expressed concern about the precedent that might be set if physicians were permitted to ignore consent procedures based on their individual judgment about emergency circumstances. Jessica found the media attention both helpful and burdensome, as it brought public support for her position, but also increased the pressure on the medical board to demonstrate their commitment to maintaining professional standards. She had been careful to avoid making public statements that might prejudice her case, but the extensive coverage meant that board members would likely be aware of the public interest in their decision and the potential criticism they might face regardless of their ruling. As the hearing date approached, Jessica struggled with emotions that ranged from confidence in the righteousness of her cause to anxiety about the potential consequences of an adverse ruling. She had received hundreds of letters and emails from medical professionals, patients, and community members expressing support for her actions and encouragement for her upcoming hearing. The outpouring of support was gratifying, but it also reminded her of how much was at stake and how many people were counting on her case to establish important precedents for future medical practice. The night before her hearing, Jessica visited Tommy Chun at his family's home, where she found him playing soccer in the backyard with neighborhood children. His energy and obvious health provided powerful testimony to the success of her decision to operate despite the procedural obstacles. Watching him run and laugh with his friends, Jessica felt renewed confidence that she had made the right choice and that the medical board would ultimately recognize the appropriateness of her actions. Mrs. Chen invited Jessica to join the family for dinner, and they spent the evening communicating through a mixture of broken English, simple Spanish, and universal gestures of warmth and gratitude. Tommy showed Jessica his school projects and talked excitedly about his plans to become a doctor when he grew up, inspired by the woman who had saved his life. The family's obvious affection and appreciation provided emotional sustenance for Jessica as she prepared to defend her decision before the medical board. The Texas Medical Board hearing took place in a sterile conference room in downtown Austin, where fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across mahogany tables and official portraits of former board chairmen gazed down with expressions of stern disapproval. Jessica arrived early, accompanied by her attorney Sarah Williams and Dr. Margaret Foster, who would serve as her expert witness on medical ethics. The formal setting felt surreal after months of preparation, as though the complex human drama of Tommy Chun's case was being reduced to legal procedures and regulatory technicalities. The board consisted of 12 members, including 8 physicians from various specialties and 4 public representatives, appointed to provide non-medical perspectives on professional conduct issues. Board Chairman Dr. Robert Harrison, a distinguished internist from Houston, called the hearing to order with a brief statement about the serious nature of the charges and the board's commitment to maintaining the highest standards of medical practice in Texas. Dr. Parker, Chairman Harrison began, "You stand accused of performing surgical intervention without proper informed consent, willfully disregarding hospital policies, and endangering patient safety through unauthorized medical treatment. These are serious charges that strike at the heart of medical ethics and patient rights. You have the right to present evidence and testimony in your defense, after which this board will deliberate and render its decision. The prosecution's case was presented by Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a medical board investigator who had compiled extensive documentation about the events surrounding Tommy's surgery. Dr. Reynolds methodically reviewed the timeline of Tommy's arrival at the hospital, the consultation with hospital legal staff, and Jessica's decision to proceed with surgery. Despite explicit instructions to wait for proper consent procedures, her presentation was clinical and unemotional, focusing entirely on Jessica's failure to follow established protocols while making no mention of Tommy's critical medical condition. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Dr. Parker had multiple alternatives available to her, Dr. Reynolds argued. Translation services were accessible, even if delayed. Emergency court authorization could have been sought through established legal channels. Hospital administration was actively working to resolve the consent issues through appropriate procedures. Dr. Parker chose to ignore these alternatives and proceed with unauthorized surgical intervention that violated state medical laws and fundamental principles of patient autonomy. Dr. Reynolds called Dr. Richard Matthews as her primary witness, and his testimony proved to be even more damaging than Jessica had anticipated. Matthews portrayed her decision as reckless and impulsive, suggesting that she had acted out of personal frustration rather than medical necessity. He emphasized the availability of alternative approaches to the consent problem, while minimizing the time constraints that had made those alternatives impractical. "In my 30 years of surgical practice," Matthews testified, "I have never encountered a situation that justified completely bypassing informed consent procedures. Emergency medical situations require quick thinking and decisive action, but they do not absolve physicians of their obligation to respect patient rights and follow established protocols." Dr. Parker's actions set a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire foundation of medical ethics. Matthews' testimony was particularly effective because of his credentials and reputation within the Texas medical community. As chief of surgery at a major teaching hospital, his opinion carried significant weight with board members who might be inclined to defer to institutional authority on questions of professional conduct. His characterization of Jessica's actions as unprecedented and dangerous provided the board with a rationale for imposing severe sanctions without appearing to minimize the importance of emergency medical care. The prosecution's case concluded with testimony from the hospital's legal counsel, who explained the potential liability issues that Jessica's actions had created for the institution. The legal representative argued that medical consent procedures existed not only to protect patients but also to shield healthcare providers from malpractice claims and regulatory violations. By circumventing these procedures, Jessica had exposed both herself and the hospital to legal risks that could have been avoided through patient compliance with established protocols. Sarah Williams began Jessica's defense by calling Dr. Amanda Shun to testify about the medical circumstances that had led to Jessica's decision. Amanda's testimony was compelling and emotional, as she described Tommy's deteriorating condition and the clear medical necessity for immediate surgical intervention. Her experience as an emergency physician lent credibility to her assessment that traditional consent procedures would have resulted in Tommy's death. "I have worked in emergency medicine for 15 years, Amanda testified, "and I have never seen a case where the medical urgency was more clear-cut. Tommy Chun was dying from internal bleeding that could only be stopped through immediate surgery. Every minute of delay increased his risk of death or permanent disability. Dr. Parker's decision to operate was not only medically appropriate, but absolutely necessary to save this child's life." Amanda's testimony was followed by Dr. Foster's expert analysis of the ethical frameworks that supported Jessica's decision. Dr. Foster explained that medical ethics had always recognized emergency situations as exceptions to standard consent, procedures, and that physicians had both the authority and the obligation to provide life-saving treatment when delays would result in patient harm. Her testimony was sophisticated and persuasive, drawing on decades of ethical scholarship and clinical experience. The fundamental principle of medical ethics is to do no harm, Dr. Foster explained to the board. In Tommy Chun's case, following standard consent procedures would have constituted harm by allowing a preventable death to occur. Dr. Parker faced an impossible choice between violating procedural requirements and violating her ethical obligation to preserve life. She chose correctly by prioritizing the patient's welfare over institutional compliance. Dr. Foster's testimony addressed the board's concerns about setting dangerous precedents by emphasizing that emergency exceptions to consent requirements were already well established in medical ethics and law. She argued that Jessica's case fell clearly within existing emergency provisions and that sanctioning her would actually create a dangerous precedent by suggesting that physicians should prioritize bureaucratic procedures over patient welfare in life-threatening situations. The most powerful moment of Jessica's defense came when she took the stand to testify on her own behalf. She had prepared extensively for this moment, working with Sarah Williams to craft testimony that would be both legally effective and emotionally compelling. However, when she began to speak about her decision to operate on Tommy, her words came from the heart rather than from legal strategy. "I became a doctor to save lives," Jessica testified, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "When I saw Tommy Chun bleeding to death while lawyers debated consent procedures, I had a choice to make. I could follow institutional protocols and watch a child die, or I could use my skills and training to save his life. I chose to save him, and I would make that same choice again without hesitation." Jessica's testimony included detailed medical explanations of Tommy's condition and the time constraints that had made traditional consent procedures impossible. She walked the board through her decision-making process, explaining how she had considered alternative approaches before concluding that immediate surgery was the only viable option. Her medical expertise was evident as she described the surgical procedure and the successful outcome that had vindicated her judgment. "I want to be clear that I did not take the decision to proceed without formal consent lightly," Jessica continued. "I understood the risks and the potential consequences for my career, but I also understood that Tommy Chun would die if I did not act immediately. As a physician, I have an obligation that transcends institutional policies and legal procedures. I have an obligation to preserve life whenever possible, and that is exactly what I did." The board's questioning of Jessica was intensive and sometimes hostile, as several members challenged her assertion that emergency circumstances justified her actions. They pressed her on whether she had fully explored alternative approaches to the consent problem and whether her decision had been influenced by personal biases rather than objective medical criteria. Jessica answered each question carefully and thoughtfully, acknowledging the complexity of the situation while maintaining that her decision had been medically necessary and ethically appropriate. Dr. Harrison, the board chairman, asked the most difficult question of the hearing. "Dr. Parker, if we accept your argument that emergency circumstances justified bypassing consent procedures in this case, how do we prevent other physicians from using similar justifications to override patient rights in situations where the emergency may be less clear-cut?" Jessica had anticipated this question and had prepared a thoughtful response that addressed the board's concerns about maintaining professional standards while recognizing the reality of emergency medical situations. "Chairman Harrison, I believe the answer lies in maintaining the high standards of medical training and professional judgment that already govern emergency medical practice. Physicians are trained to assess medical urgency and make critical decisions under pressure. We trust them to determine when emergency procedures are necessary and we should trust them to determine when emergency exceptions to consent requirements are appropriate. The hearing concluded with closing arguments from both sides, followed by the board's deliberation in closed session. The Texas Medical Board's deliberation lasted 4 grueling hours, during which Jessica sat in the courthouse hallway with her attorney and supporters, watching the afternoon sun cast shifting patterns across the marble floor. When the board finally reconvened, Chairman Harrison's expression was unreadable as he called the session to order and prepared to announce their decision. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the soft scratching of court reporters' pens and the distant hum of air conditioning. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, Chairman Harrison began, his voice measured and formal. This board finds that Dr. Jessica Parker acted within the bounds of emergency medical protocols in her treatment of Tommy Chun, while her failure to follow standard consent procedures raises concerns about institutional compliance. The board recognizes that the critical nature of the patient's condition justified deviation from normal protocols in this specific instance. Jessica felt her knees weaken with relief as the words sank in. She had been vindicated, cleared of the charges that had threatened to destroy her career and professional reputation. Sarah Williams squeezed her hand under the table while Dr. Foster smiled with satisfaction at the outcome they had fought so hard to achieve. The decision represented not just a personal victory for Jessica, but a validation of the principle that physician judgment should take precedence over bureaucratic procedures when lives were at stake. However, Chairman Harrison's next words tempered the celebration. While this board finds that Dr. Parker's actions were justified under the specific circumstances of this case, we must also issue a formal reprimand regarding her failure to exhaust all available alternatives before proceeding with unauthorized treatment. Healthcare institutions rely on established procedures to protect both patients and providers, and physicians must make every reasonable effort to work within these systems before taking independent action. The formal reprimand would become part of Jessica's permanent professional record, a notation that future employers and licensing boards would see whenever they reviewed her credentials. While far less severe than license suspension or revocation, the reprimand represented a compromise that allowed the board to uphold professional standards while acknowledging the emergency circumstances that had driven Jessica's decision. It was a victory, but one that came with lasting consequences for her professional standing. Dr. Harrison continued with additional guidance that would affect how similar cases might be handled in the future. This board strongly encouraged all healthcare institutions to review their emergency consent procedures to ensure that life-threatening situations can be addressed promptly while maintaining appropriate patient protections. We also recommend enhanced training for medical staff regarding the proper invocation of emergency treatment protocols. The decision was immediately controversial within the medical community, with some physicians celebrating the board's recognition of emergency circumstances while others expressed concern about the precedent it might set for future cases. Medical blogs and professional journals began analyzing the ruling within hours of its announcement, debating its implications for the balance between patient autonomy and medical necessity in emergency situations. Jessica's first stop after leaving the courthouse was Children's Medical Center, where she hoped to resume her surgical duties and begin rebuilding her career. However, she quickly discovered that her legal vindication did not automatically restore her previous status within the hospital hierarchy. Dr. Richard Matthews, who had testified against her during the hearing, remained as chief of surgery and made it clear that her return would be subject to additional institutional review. While the medical board has cleared you of criminal wrongdoing, Matthews explained during their uncomfortable reunion meeting, the hospital administration must still address the internal policy violations that occurred during the Chun case. We cannot simply pretend that established procedures were not violated, regardless of the outcome or the board's decision. The hospital's internal review process proved to be almost as lengthy and contentious as the medical board hearing had been. Jessica was required to undergo additional ethics training, participate in mandatory counseling regarding institutional compliance, and accept closer supervision of her surgical cases for a probationary period of 6 months. While these requirements allowed her to return to practice, they also served as constant reminders of her controversial decision and its ongoing consequences. More troubling was the subtle but unmistakable change in how some colleagues treated Jessica following her return. While many expressed support for her actions and relief at her vindication, others maintained a careful distance that suggested disapproval or concern about being associated with someone who had challenged institutional authority. Hospital politics were complex and unforgiving, and Jessica realized that her reputation as a physician who would prioritize patient care over institutional compliance could be both an asset and a liability. The Chun family remained deeply grateful for Jessica's intervention, with Tommy making a complete recovery and returning to his normal childhood activities. Mrs. Chun had learned enough English to express her thanks more directly, while Mr. Chun had found steady employment and was working toward permanent residency status. Tommy himself had become something of a local celebrity at his school, where his teachers used his story as an example of the importance of healthcare access and the dedication of medical professionals. However, Jessica's relationship with the Chun family was complicated by the ongoing media attention surrounding her case. Reporters continued to seek interviews and updates about Tommy's progress, making it difficult for the family to move past the traumatic events and return to normal life. Jessica respected their desire for privacy and limited her contact with them to necessary medical follow-ups, but she couldn't help feeling that the controversy surrounding her case had made their lives more difficult rather than easier. Financial impact of Jessica's legal battle had been substantial, with attorney fees and lost income during her suspension, creating debts that would take years to repay. The legal defense fund organized by her colleagues had helped cover some expenses, but the combination of reduced earning capacity during her probationary period and ongoing legal costs created financial pressures that affected every aspect of her life. She was forced to sell her car and move to a smaller apartment, adjustments that served as daily reminders of the price she had paid for her decision to save Tommy's life. Despite these challenges, Jessica found unexpected sources of support and encouragement as news of her case spread beyond the Texas medical community. Medical schools began inviting her to speak to students about medical ethics and emergency decision-making, while professional organizations asked her to participate in conferences about healthcare policy and patient advocacy. These opportunities provided supplemental income and helped her build a national reputation as an expert on medical ethics and emergency procedures. The speaking engagements also connected Jessica with other physicians who had faced similar ethical dilemmas in their own practices. She discovered that her experience was far from unique, with doctors across the country regularly confronting situations where institutional policies conflicted with patient needs. Many of these physicians had chosen to comply with institutional requirements rather than risk their careers, leaving them with lingering doubts about patients they might have helped if they had been willing to challenge established procedures. These conversations reinforced Jessica's belief that her case represented broader systemic problems within American healthcare rather than an isolated incident of poor judgment or institutional conflict. The increasing bureaucratization of medical practice, driven by legitimate concerns about liability and quality control, was creating barriers to patient care that sometimes conflicted with physicians' fundamental obligation to preserve life. Her case had exposed these tensions in a dramatic way, but similar conflicts occurred daily in hospitals across the country. Jessica began writing about her experiences, contributing articles to medical journals and healthcare policy publications about the challenges of balancing institutional compliance with patient advocacy. Her writing drew on both her personal experience and her broader research into healthcare systems and medical ethics, offering practical suggestions for how institutions could better support physicians facing emergency situations while maintaining appropriate oversight and quality controls. The positive response to her writing led to opportunities for Jessica to participate in healthcare policy discussions at the state and national levels. She was invited to testify before legislative committees considering healthcare reform measures, where her first-hand experience with the consequences of rigid institutional procedures provided compelling evidence for the need for more flexible emergency protocols. These policy activities became an increasingly important part of her professional identity, complementing her clinical work and helping her feel that her controversial decision had contributed to positive changes in the healthcare system. However, the policy work also reminded Jessica of how slowly institutional change occurred and how resistant healthcare systems were to modifications that might increase liability or reduce administrative control. While her case had generated significant discussion about emergency consent procedures, most hospitals continued to rely on the same rigid protocols that had nearly cost Tommy Chun his life. The gap between policy discussions and practical implementation remained frustratingly wide, limiting the real-world impact of her advocacy efforts. 6 months after Jessica's return to surgical practice at Children's Medical Center, the institutional consequences of her decision to operate on Tommy Chun began to manifest in ways that were more subtle but equally damaging than the formal medical board proceedings. While she had been officially cleared of wrongdoing and allowed to resume her duties, the hospital administration had quietly implemented a series of policy changes that effectively marginalized her role and limited her ability to advocate for patients in emergency situations. The most significant change was the implementation of a new emergency consultation protocol that required all surgical interventions in cases involving consent complications to be approved by a committee consisting of the chief of surgery, a legal representative, and a hospital administrator. This committee was required to convene within 2 hours of any consultation request, effectively adding a bureaucratic layer to emergency decision-making that could prove fatal in time-sensitive situations. Jessica recognized immediately that this protocol had been designed specifically to prevent situations like Tommy's case from recurring, but she also understood that it would create dangerous delays in cases where immediate surgical intervention was necessary to save lives. The 2-hour committee consultation requirement was presented as a reasonable compromise between emergency care and institutional protection. But Jessica knew from experience that critically injured children often did not have 2 hours to spare. Dr. Matthews had also restructured the pediatric surgery department in ways that reduced Jessica's autonomy and influence within the hospital. Her surgical caseload was gradually shifted toward routine procedures and scheduled operations, while emergency consultations were increasingly assigned to other surgeons who were perceived as more compliant with institutional policies. The changes were implemented gradually and justified on operational grounds, making them difficult to challenge formally while effectively sidling Jessica from the emergency cases that had always been central to her practice. The isolation Jessica experienced within her own department was particularly painful because it came from colleagues who had previously respected her skills and judgment. Many of her fellow surgeons privately supported her decision regarding Tommy Chun, but they were unwilling to risk their own careers by associating too closely with someone who had challenged institutional authority. The result was a professional loneliness that made Jessica's daily work increasingly difficult and unrewarding. Hospital administrators began scrutinizing Jessica's cases more closely than those of her colleagues, requiring additional documentation and justification for clinical decisions that would normally be considered routine. She was required to obtain supervisory approval for procedures that other surgeons performed independently, and her surgical schedules were subject to last-minute changes that disrupted her ability to plan patient care effectively. These administrative burdens were presented as quality improvement measures, but Jessica understood them as punishment for her failure to comply with institutional expectations. The psychological toll of working in an environment where her judgment was constantly questioned began to affect Jessica's confidence and clinical performance. She found herself second-guessing decisions that she would previously have made instinctively, knowing that any unusual choice would be subject to intensive review and potential criticism. The spontaneous problem-solving and creative thinking that had made her an excellent emergency surgeon were being replaced by defensive decision-making designed to avoid institutional conflict rather than optimize patient care. Jessica's research activities and speaking engagements about medical ethics had initially been welcomed by hospital administration as evidence of the institution's commitment to thoughtful healthcare policy. However, as her national profile grew and her criticism of rigid institutional procedures became more prominent, the hospital began discouraging her external activities and suggesting that they interfered with her clinical responsibilities. Speaking requests were increasingly denied due to scheduling conflicts or departmental needs that seemed to arise whenever Jessica was invited to address controversial topics. The most devastating blow came when Jessica was passed over for promotion to Associate Chief of Pediatric Surgery, a position she had been expected to receive based on her seniority, clinical skills, and research productivity. The promotion was instead given to a younger colleague whose qualifications were clearly inferior, but who had maintained a low profile during the Tommy Chun controversy. Hospital administration explained the decision as being based on leadership potential and institutional commitment, language that Jessica understood as code for willingness to prioritize administrative compliance over patient advocacy. The promotion denial forced Jessica to confront the reality that her career trajectory had been fundamentally altered by her decision to save Tommy's life. While she had been vindicated by the medical board and praised by external observers, she was paying a significant professional price within her own institution. The subtle but persistent retaliation she was experiencing would likely continue as long as she remained at Children's Medical Center, limiting her opportunities for advancement and forcing her to work in an environment where her judgment was perpetually questioned. Financial pressures continued to mount as Jessica's reduced role within the hospital led to decreased surgical volume and corresponding reductions in income. The combination of ongoing legal debts, reduced earning capacity, and the costs associated with her speaking and policy activities created a financial situation that was becoming increasingly unsustainable. She was forced to consider whether remaining at Children's Medical Center was economically viable, even if she could tolerate the professional isolation and administrative harassment. The situation was complicated by Jessica's genuine affection for many of her patients and their families, who had come to trust her expertise and advocacy over the years she had spent building her practice. Leaving the hospital would mean abandoning these relationships and forcing families to establish new therapeutic connections with physicians who might not share her commitment to patient-centered care. The personal cost of leaving was significant, but the professional cost of staying was becoming equally problematic. Jessica began quietly exploring opportunities at other hospitals and medical centers, hoping to find an institution where her advocacy approach would be valued rather than punished. However, she quickly discovered that her reputation had preceded her, with potential employers expressing concern about hiring someone who had been involved in such a controversial case. While most acknowledged that she had been cleared of wrongdoing, they also worried about the potential for similar conflicts at their own institutions. The job search process was humbling and discouraging, as Jessica realized that her decision to prioritize patient care over institutional compliance had made her a liability in the eyes of many healthcare administrators. Hospitals were increasingly risk-averse and preferred physicians who would work within established systems, rather than challenge procedures that might create legal or regulatory complications. Her advocacy work and speaking activities, which she had hoped would demonstrate her expertise and thoughtfulness, were instead viewed as evidence that she might create similar controversies at future employers. During this difficult period, Jessica received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the chief medical officer at Dallas Methodist Hospital, a smaller institution with a reputation for innovative patient care and physician autonomy. Dr. Warren had been following Jessica's case and was interested in discussing opportunities for collaboration on emergency medicine protocols and medical ethics training. The conversation was encouraging and suggested that some institutions might value her experience and perspective rather than view them as liabilities. Dr. Warren explained that Dallas Methodist was in the process of developing new approaches to emergency consent procedures that would balance patient safety with institutional protection while avoiding the bureaucratic delays that had nearly cost Tommy Chun his life. They were seeking a physician with both clinical expertise and policy experience to lead this initiative, and Jessica's background made her an ideal candidate for the position. The opportunity represented not just a career change, but a chance to transform her controversial experience into positive contributions to healthcare policy and practice. The offer from Dallas Methodist forced Jessica to make a difficult decision about her future at Children's Medical Center. While leaving would mean abandoning the relationships and institutional knowledge she had built over 7 years, staying would likely mean continued marginalization and gradual erosion of her clinical role. The opportunity to lead policy development at another institution offered the possibility of turning her experience with Tommy Chun into a platform for broader healthcare improvements. Jessica's decision was influenced by a conversation with Tommy Chun himself, who had recently celebrated his 9th birthday and was thriving in school despite the traumatic events that had brought them together. Tommy's parents had arranged the meeting as a way of thanking Jessica for her continued advocacy work and expressing their hope that her efforts would help other families facing similar situations. Tommy had drawn pictures of doctors and hospitals, explaining that he wanted to become a physician like Jessica when he grew up. "I want to help kids like you helped me," Tommy told Jessica in his improving English, his earnest expression reminding her of why she had chosen medicine as a career. "My mama says you were brave and did the right thing even when it was hard." The conversation with Tommy reinforced Jessica's belief that her decision had been correct and that the institutional retaliation she was experiencing was ultimately less important than the lives she might save through her advocacy work. His recovery and enthusiasm for helping others provided evidence that her controversial choice had created positive ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate medical intervention. The possibility of using her experience to develop better policies and training programs offered a way to multiply that positive impact. Jessica's final day at Children's Medical Center arrived on a gray December morning, marked by an understated ceremony that reflected the complex emotions surrounding her departure. While some colleagues gathered to express their appreciation for her years of service and wish her well in her new position, others maintained the careful distance that had characterized their interactions since the Tommy Chun controversy. The mixed response captured the divided opinions within the medical community about her decision and its consequences. Dr. Richard Matthews offered perfunctory remarks about Jessica's contributions to the department while carefully avoiding any reference to the case that had defined her final months at the hospital. His speech emphasized her surgical skills and dedication to patient care, while implicitly suggesting that her departure was mutually beneficial for both Jessica and the institution. The subtext was clear to everyone present: talented physicians who could not work within established systems were ultimately liabilities regardless of their clinical abilities. Jessica's response was gracious and professional, thanking her colleagues for their support while acknowledging the challenges that had led to her decision to seek new opportunities. She spoke about the privilege of serving the diverse patient population at Children's Medical Center and her hope that the policy discussions generated by recent events would ultimately improve emergency care for all children. Her carefully chosen words avoided direct criticism of the hospital, while making it clear that she remained committed to advocacy and policy reform. The personal belongings Jessica packed from her office told the story of a career that had been both fulfilling and controversial. Awards and commendations from medical organizations sat alongside thank you cards from grateful families and newspaper clippings about the Tommy Chun case. Professional journals containing her published articles shared space with legal documents from the medical board hearing and correspondence from healthcare policy organizations seeking her input on reform proposals. Among the most treasured items was a hand-drawn picture from Tommy Chun, showing a female doctor in a white coat standing next to a smiling child in a hospital bed. The drawing was accompanied by a note in Tommy's careful handwriting. "Thank you, Dr. Jessica, for saving my life and teaching me to be brave." The simple artwork captured the human impact of Jessica's decision more powerfully than any legal document or professional testimony ever could. Jessica's move to Dallas Methodist Hospital represented both a new beginning and acknowledgement that her career had been fundamentally changed by her decision to prioritize patient care over institutional compliance. While she was excited about the opportunity to develop innovative emergency protocols and lead policy reform initiatives, she also understood that her reputation as a controversial figure would follow her to any new position. The challenge would be transforming that controversy into positive change while rebuilding her clinical practice and professional relationships. The financial impact of Jessica's career transition was significant, as her new position at Dallas Methodist included a substantial reduction in salary compared to her previous role at Children's Medical Center. The policy development and medical ethics work that comprised a major part of her new responsibilities were less lucrative than clinical surgery, requiring Jessica to adjust her lifestyle and financial expectations accordingly. The ongoing legal debts from her medical board defense compounded these challenges, creating economic pressures that would persist for several years. Dallas Methodist Hospital's approach to emergency medicine was notably different from the bureaucratic procedures that had characterized Children's Medical Center. The smaller institution emphasized physician autonomy and clinical judgment, while maintaining appropriate oversight and quality controls. Dr. Elizabeth Warren had assembled a team of clinicians, administrators, and legal experts who were committed to developing emergency protocols that prioritized patient care while managing institutional risks effectively. Jessica's first project at Dallas Methodist involved reviewing emergency consent procedures and developing training programs that would help physicians navigate complex situations involving time constraints, language barriers, and family dynamics. The work drew directly on her experience with Tommy Chun, while incorporating best practices from emergency medicine programs across the country. The goal was to create protocols that would prevent the kind of bureaucratic delays that had nearly cost Tommy his life while ensuring appropriate patient protections and institutional safeguards. The policy development work was intellectually stimulating and personally meaningful, allowing Jessica to channel her controversial experience into constructive contributions to healthcare improvement. However, it also required her to relive the traumatic events surrounding Tommy's case as she analyzed decision-making processes and institutional responses. The emotional toll of constantly revisiting that difficult period was significant, contributing to stress and anxiety that affected both her professional performance and personal well-being. Jessica's clinical practice at Dallas Methodist was initially limited as she focused on policy development activities and worked to establish relationships with new colleagues and patients. The reduced surgical volume was both a practical necessity, given her other responsibilities and a reflection of the time required to build trust and referral patterns at a new institution. While she missed the intensive clinical engagement that had characterized her work at Children's Medical Center, she also appreciated the opportunity to approach medicine from a broader policy perspective. The transition to a new hospital also meant leaving behind the patient relationships that had sustained Jessica throughout her career at Children's Medical Center. Families who had trusted her with their children's care for years were forced to establish new therapeutic connections, while Jessica had to build her reputation and expertise recognition from scratch. The personal cost of these severed relationships was substantial, as many of these families had become extended parts of Jessica's professional family over the years. Media attention surrounding Jessica's career transition generated renewed interest in the Tommy Chun case and its broader implications for healthcare policy. Medical journals and policy publications covered her move to Dallas Methodist as evidence of the ongoing challenges faced by physicians who challenged institutional authority, while patient advocacy groups highlighted her experience as an example of the need for healthcare reform. The continued publicity was both helpful for her policy work and burdensome for her personal life. Jessica's speaking engagements about medical ethics and emergency protocols increased following her move to Dallas Methodist, as healthcare organizations sought her perspective on developing more flexible and responsive emergency procedures. These activities provided supplemental income and helped establish her national reputation as an expert on healthcare policy, but they also required extensive travel and time away from clinical practice. The balance between policy work and patient care became an ongoing challenge that required careful management. The psychological impact of the career upheaval was significant, as Jessica struggled with feelings of loss and uncertainty about her professional future. While she remained convinced that her decision regarding Tommy Chun had been correct, she also had to confront the reality that principled stands sometimes came with lasting personal and professional costs. The support of colleagues at Dallas Methodist was encouraging, but it could not fully compensate for the relationships and institutional knowledge she had left behind. Financial counseling became necessary as Jessica worked to manage the ongoing costs of her legal defense, while adjusting to reduced income and increased expenses associated with her career transition. The combination of legal debts, moving costs, and salary reduction created a financial situation that required careful budgeting and lifestyle adjustments. She was forced to delay plans for purchasing a home and reduce discretionary spending while working to rebuild her financial stability. Despite these challenges, Jessica found meaning and purpose in her policy work that helped compensate for the personal and professional costs of her transition. The opportunity to develop protocols that might prevent other physicians from facing similar ethical dilemmas provided a sense of contribution that extended beyond individual patient care. Her experience with Tommy Chun, while traumatic and costly, had positioned her to make broader contributions to healthcare improvement that might ultimately benefit thousands of patients and providers. On a quiet Thursday afternoon in March, 8 months after Jessica had begun her work at Dallas Methodist Hospital, she was reviewing emergency protocol drafts in her small policy office when her secretary announced an unexpected visitor. Agent Patricia Collins from the United States Department of Health and Human Services had arrived without an appointment and was requesting an immediate meeting regarding Jessica's work on emergency medical procedures and patient advocacy. Agent Collins was a poised woman in her mid-40s who carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex federal issues. Her credentials identified her as a senior investigator specializing in healthcare, policy compliance, and medical ethics cases that crossed state boundaries or involved federal regulations. The gravity of her presence immediately put Jessica on alert, as federal involvement in medical cases typically indicated issues of significant scope and importance. Dr. Parker, I apologize for arriving unannounced, but the nature of my visit requires discretion and confidentiality. Agent Collins began as they settled into Jessica's office. I've been following your case and your subsequent policy work with great interest, and I believe you may be able to assist with a federal investigation that has significant implications for healthcare policy nationwide. Jessica felt her pulse quicken as she realized that her involvement in the Tommy Chun case had apparently attracted attention from federal authorities. While she had been cleared of wrongdoing by the Texas Medical Board, the possibility of federal scrutiny created new anxieties about the long-term consequences of her controversial decision. She waited for Agent Collins to explain the purpose of her visit while trying to maintain the professional composure that her policy work had taught her. The Department of Health and Human Services has been conducting a comprehensive review of emergency medical consent procedures across the United States, Agent Collins continued. Our investigation has identified systematic problems with how healthcare institutions balance patient care against liability protection, particularly in cases involving vulnerable populations such as immigrants, non-English speakers, and uninsured patients. The investigation Agent Collins described had been triggered by a pattern of preventable deaths and injuries that had occurred when healthcare institutions prioritized bureaucratic procedures over emergency medical interventions. The Tommy Chun case had become a focal point of the investigation because it represented both the potential consequences of rigid institutional policies and the positive outcomes that could result when physicians exercised independent clinical judgment in emergency situations. What makes your case particularly significant, Agent Collins explained, is that you achieved an optimal medical outcome by deviating from established procedures, and your subsequent advocacy work has provided detailed documentation of the institutional factors that create barriers to emergency care. Your experience offers unique insights into both the problems we're investigating and potential solutions that could prevent similar situations in the future. Jessica learned that the federal investigation had identified dozens of cases across the country where patients had died or suffered permanent injuries because healthcare institutions had prioritized legal compliance over emergency medical care. Many of these cases involved immigrant families, non-English speakers, or uninsured patients who faced additional barriers to accessing timely treatment. The pattern suggested systematic discrimination and potential violations of federal healthcare access laws. The scope of the investigation was broader than Jessica had imagined, encompassing not just individual cases, but the institutional policies and legal frameworks that influenced emergency medical decision-making. Federal investigators were examining whether current consent procedures created disparate impacts on vulnerable populations and whether healthcare institutions were violating civil rights laws by implementing policies that effectively denied emergency care to certain groups of patients. We're particularly interested in your policy development work at Dallas Methodist, Agent Collins continued. The emergency protocols you've been developing could serve as a model for federal guidelines that would ensure timely emergency care while maintaining appropriate patient protections. Your experience with both the clinical and policy aspects of these issues makes you uniquely qualified to contribute to this effort. The opportunity Agent Collins presented was both exciting and daunting, as it offered Jessica the chance to transform her controversial experience into federal policy that could affect healthcare delivery nationwide. However, it also meant becoming involved in a high-profile federal investigation that would inevitably attract significant media attention and political scrutiny. The decision would require careful consideration of both the potential benefits and the personal costs of increased public visibility. Jessica's work at Dallas Methodist had already demonstrated the feasibility of developing emergency protocols that balanced rapid patient care with appropriate safeguards. The procedures she had helped create allowed physicians to provide emergency treatment in cases involving consent complications while ensuring that patient rights were protected and institutional risks were managed. The success of these protocols had attracted attention from other hospitals and medical organizations seeking to implement similar approaches. Agent Collins explained that the federal investigation was being conducted in coordination with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, which was examining whether discriminatory healthcare policies violated federal civil rights laws. The involvement of civil rights investigators suggested that the issues raised by Jessica's case had implications beyond medical ethics and healthcare policy, potentially affecting broader questions of equal access to emergency medical care. The timing of Agent Collins' visit was significant because Congress was considering healthcare reform legislation that would address emergency medical consent procedures and patient access issues. Jessica's case and the federal investigation it had helped trigger were providing evidence for policymakers about the need for federal standards that would prevent institutional policies from interfering with emergency medical care. Her expertise and experience could influence the development of legislation that would affect millions of patients nationwide. "I want to be clear about what we're asking," Agent Collins said as their meeting continued. "We're seeking your cooperation as a consultant and expert witness regarding emergency medical procedures and their implementation. This would involve working with federal policy teams to develop recommendations for healthcare reform legislation and potentially testifying before congressional committees about your experience and expertise. The federal consultation opportunity would significantly expand Jessica's policy work beyond the hospital level to national healthcare reform efforts. It represented a chance to ensure that the lessons learned from Tommy Chun's case would influence federal law and prevent similar situations from occurring in hospitals across the country. However, it would also require her to become a public figure in controversial political debates about healthcare policy and civil rights. Jessica asked for time to consider Agent Collins' proposal and discuss it with her colleagues at Dallas Methodist Hospital. The decision would affect not just her own career, but potentially the reputation and interests of her current employer, which had provided her with the opportunity to rebuild her professional life after the controversies at Children's Medical Center. She wanted to ensure that her involvement in federal policy work would not create new complications for the institution that had supported her. Dr. Elizabeth Warren was enthusiastic about Jessica's opportunity to contribute to federal healthcare policy, viewing it as validation of the innovative work being conducted at Dallas Methodist. The hospital administration saw Jessica's expertise recognition as evidence of their commitment to cutting-edge healthcare policy and patient advocacy. They agreed to provide institutional support for her federal consultation work while ensuring that her clinical and policy responsibilities at the hospital continued to receive appropriate attention. The conversation with Agent Collins had provided Jessica with a new perspective on the significance of her decision to operate on Tommy Chun and the broader implications of the institutional conflicts she had experienced. What had initially seemed like a personal crisis and career setback was now being recognized as part of a national pattern that required federal intervention to protect patient rights and ensure equal access to emergency medical care. The federal investigation also provided context for the institutional retaliation Jessica had experienced at Children's Medical Center, suggesting that her treatment was part of a broader pattern of how healthcare institutions responded to physicians who challenged established procedures. The systematic nature of these problems indicated that individual advocacy and policy work, while important, might not be sufficient to address issues that required federal intervention and legislative solutions. As Jessica prepared to make her decision about federal consultation work, she reflected on the journey that had begun with her choice to save Tommy Chun's life. That single decision had led to professional controversy, career upheaval, and personal challenges that had fundamentally changed her life. However, it had also positioned her to contribute to healthcare policy reforms that could prevent other physicians from facing similar ethical dilemmas and ensure that emergency medical care was available to all patients regardless of their circumstances. The possibility of contributing to federal healthcare reform represented both an opportunity and a responsibility that Jessica could not take lightly. Her experience had provided her with unique insights into the challenges faced by both physicians and patients in emergency medical situations, and her policy work had demonstrated the feasibility of developing better approaches to these challenges. The question was whether she was prepared for the increased public scrutiny and political pressures that would accompany involvement in federal policy development. Jessica's decision would ultimately depend on her assessment of whether federal consultation work would allow her to make meaningful contributions to healthcare improvement while maintaining her clinical practice and personal well-being. The opportunity represented a chance to ensure that Tommy Chun's case would have lasting positive impacts on American healthcare, but it would also require her to accept the role of public advocate and policy expert that she had never originally sought. 3 weeks after Agent Patricia Collins' initial visit, Jessica found herself in a secure conference room within the Department of Health and Human Services headquarters in Washington, D.C., surrounded by federal investigators, policy analysts, and legal experts who had spent months documenting a pattern of healthcare discrimination that extended far beyond her individual case. The sterile government office, with its fluorescent lighting and beige walls lined with charts and case files, felt worlds away from the operating rooms where she had spent most of her career. Yet the human stories contained in those files were heartbreakingly familiar. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the lead federal investigator coordinating the Healthcare Access Review, began the briefing by explaining the scope of their findings. Dr. Parker, what happened to you and Tommy Chun represents just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Our investigation has identified over 300 documented cases in the past 5 years where healthcare institutions have used consent procedures, documentation requirements, or liability concerns to delay or deny emergency medical care to vulnerable populations. The statistical presentation that followed was staggering in its implications. Federal investigators had documented systematic patterns of discrimination that disproportionately affected immigrant families, non-English speakers, uninsured patients, and individuals from ethnic minorities. Emergency departments across the country were routinely implementing policies that created additional barriers to care for these populations, while streamlining procedures for patients with insurance, documentation, and English proficiency. The Tommy Chun case became significant to our investigation, not because it was unique, but because it was so typical, Dr. Rodriguez continued. What made it different was that you chose to prioritize patient care over institutional compliance, and the positive outcome of that decision provided clear evidence that many of these discriminatory delays are medically unnecessary and potentially fatal. Jessica learned that federal investigators had been monitoring her case from the beginning, recognizing its potential significance for broader healthcare policy issues. The medical board hearing had been closely watched by federal attorneys who were building cases against healthcare institutions that violated civil rights laws through discriminatory emergency care policies. Her vindication had provided important legal precedent for challenging similar policies nationwide. The conference room walls were covered with charts and timelines, documenting cases from hospitals across the United States where patients had died or suffered permanent injuries due to unnecessary delays in emergency care. Each case file represented a family that had experienced loss or trauma because healthcare institutions had prioritized bureaucratic procedures over medical necessity. The cumulative impact was overwhelming, suggesting that Jessica's experience represented just one visible example of a systemic problem affecting thousands of patients annually. Agent Collins presented detailed analysis of the legal and regulatory frameworks that enabled these discriminatory practices. Current federal emergency medical treatment laws require hospitals to provide stabilizing care regardless of patients' ability to pay or immigration status, but they don't specifically address consent procedures or language barriers that can be used to delay or complicate care delivery. Healthcare institutions have exploited these gaps to implement policies that effectively deny emergency care while maintaining technical compliance with federal law. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that some healthcare institutions were deliberately using complex consent procedures and documentation requirements to discourage emergency room utilization by uninsured or undocumented patients. Internal hospital communications obtained through subpoenas revealed discussions about managing patient populations and reducing liability exposure through administrative barriers that made emergency care less accessible to vulnerable communities. What's particularly troubling, Agent Collins continued, is that these discriminatory policies are often justified as quality improvement measures or patient safety initiatives. Hospitals claim they're protecting patients by ensuring proper consent and documentation, when in reality they're creating barriers that prevent timely care and contribute to poor health outcomes for vulnerable populations. Jessica's case had become a focal point for the investigation because it demonstrated both the human costs of rigid institutional policies and the positive outcomes that could result when physicians were empowered to exercise clinical judgment in emergency situations. The successful outcome of Tommy's surgery, combined with Jessica's detailed documentation of the institutional barriers she had faced, provided compelling evidence for policy reforms that would prioritize patient care over administrative compliance. Dr. Rodriguez explained that the federal investigation was being conducted in coordination with multiple agencies, including the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the Office of Inspector General. The multi-agency approach reflected the complexity of healthcare, discrimination issues, and the need for comprehensive policy responses that addressed both civil rights violations and healthcare quality concerns. We're not just documenting problems, Dr. Rodriguez emphasized. We're developing evidence-based recommendations for policy changes that would eliminate discriminatory barriers while maintaining appropriate patient protections and institutional safeguards. Your experience and policy work provide a practical model for how these reforms could be implemented effectively. The federal team had been monitoring Jessica's protocol development work at Dallas Methodist Hospital, recognizing it as a successful example of how emergency procedures could be redesigned to prioritize rapid patient care while ensuring appropriate oversight and protection. The protocols she had helped develop were being studied as potential models for federal guidelines that would standardize emergency care procedures and eliminate the institutional variations that contributed to discriminatory treatment. Jessica learned that her case had also attracted international attention from healthcare policy organizations studying emergency medical systems and patient access issues. The World Health Organization had cited her experience as an example of how institutional barriers could interfere with emergency medical care, while medical associations in other countries were using her case to examine their own emergency consent procedures and identify potential improvements. The broader significance of your case, Agent Collins explained, is that it illustrates fundamental tensions between healthcare, bureaucratization, and medical practice that exist throughout the poorest American healthcare system. Your decision to prioritize patient care over institutional compliance exposed these tensions in a dramatic way that has catalyzed policy discussions and reform efforts nationwide. The federal investigation had also revealed the extent to which healthcare institutions had retaliated against physicians who challenged discriminatory policies or advocated for vulnerable patients. Jessica's experience at Children's Medical Center was part of a documented pattern of institutional punishment directed at healthcare providers who prioritized patient needs over administrative compliance. Federal investigators were examining whether these retaliation patterns violated employment laws, and professional conduct regulations. Dr. Rodriguez presented evidence showing that healthcare institutions routinely used administrative procedures, scheduling restrictions, and peer review processes to marginalize physicians who advocated too aggressively for patient access or challenged institutional policies. The systematic nature of these retaliation patterns suggested coordinated efforts to discourage physician advocacy and maintain institutional control over emergency care procedures. What we've discovered is that your experience represents both the best and worst aspects of American healthcare, Dr. Rodriguez concluded. You demonstrated the kind of clinical excellence and patient advocacy that represents the highest ideals of medical practice, but you also experienced institutional retaliation that illustrates systemic problems with how healthcare organizations balance patient care against other institutional priorities. The federal briefing concluded with a detailed presentation of proposed policy reforms that would address the discriminatory practices documented in the investigation. The recommendations included federal standards for emergency consent procedures, mandatory language access services, prohibitions on discriminatory administrative barriers, and protections for healthcare providers who advocated for patient access. Implementation of these reforms would require congressional action and coordination between multiple federal agencies. Jessica's role in supporting these policy reforms would involve providing expert testimony about emergency medical procedures, participating in policy development committees, and serving as a public advocate for healthcare access issues. The federal consultation work would significantly expand her policy activities, while providing opportunities to influence legislation that could affect millions of patients nationwide. The personal impact of learning about the broader context of her case was profound, as Jessica realized that her individual experience represented part of a much larger struggle for healthcare equity and patient rights. The federal investigation had revealed that her decision to save Tommy Chun's life had exposed systematic problems that affected vulnerable patients across the country, transforming her personal controversy into a catalyst for national healthcare reform. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.